My heart is full being back here at Crescent Hill this morning and in Louisville. Can I tell you a couple of reasons why? In 1984, a young lady named Gushee and a young man named David Gushee moved here 8 days after we were married. And we moved into Seminary Village. Seminary Village was where we started our married life. I mainly remember it for the heat, the peeling floors, and the roaches. That's mainly what I remember. But I mainly remember was starting our life together here 40 years ago this summer. So those are happy memories. We delivered newspapers for our first employment. Then I took a job as a youth minister. I think the newspaper work was easier. 9 years later, I was one of the very last people hired by Roy Honeycutt to teach at Southern Seminary. I was signing my papers the day that a young man was named president of Southern Seminary. And so my teaching career began here. And for a brief moment, it looked like we would maybe spend our lives here. And we loved Louisville. Somewhat nicer housing in 1993 than in 1984. That was not to be. 1996, we moved away. But now 2 visits back here. I guess I came back in between. I don't really remember. But in 2018, I was invited here for the Johnson Lectures. And now this year. And in both cases, this church has welcomed me so warmly. And it's been a great experience. So thank you. And I also want to say that to me it's important to see that Crescent Hill Baptist Church has a vibrant present and a promising future and not just a meaningful past. Yesterday there were a lot of people in this room. Crescent Hill is a space and a kind of community that is needed in our time. And so keep thinking imaginatively about what that looks like. But this lectureship is part of it, I think. So, thank you. So, a sermon is different from a lecture, but I do think that a sermon can involve some teaching and some substance, if that's okay. I never thought that I remember my first effort to preach a sermon in a Southern Seminary preaching class was met with the total incomprehension of everybody in the room, including the preaching professor. I'll never forget, the guy before me preached a sermon that I thought was terribly maudlin and hokey, and the preaching professor said, "That boy is a preaching rascal." And I was next, and the preaching professor said, after I finished, "Huh," and that was it. So my confidence in my preaching in a Southern Baptist setting at that time was not strongly reinforced that day. I had to learn to find my own voice. It's mainly a teacherly preaching. If that's okay, that's what I'm going to try to offer today. Also, just a little bit more setup, I've learned to really appreciate the lectionary approach to Sunday morning. And so I whenever possible, I try to locate my message within 4 passages: a Hebrew Bible passage, a psalm, an epistle, and a gospel reading. That's how I like to do it, and I read the lectionary readings every morning, and I try to preach from within. So that's what I'm doing today. My idea was to from all the passages in the Bible that speak meaningfully about government, I selected 4. And of course, it's that selection process that is the most important thing to be said. And so I may have surprised you. You may have already been surprised in some of the passages that were read this morning. Genesis 1, Psalm 72, Romans 13, and Matthew 22. If you have your program in front of you, you're going to look at them because I'm going to be unpacking something from each of these passages. All right? It's definitely true that the Bible is full of passages that speak to government, and in fact so full that it's very difficult to decide which ones to use. And of course, the choices reflect certain decisions, certain commitments. And I decided to pick a few that are challenging. In fact, I think the most challenging one is the one that I'm going to start with, which is Romans 13, 1 through 7. I won't reread it. You'll have it in front of you. But what's happening in Romans 13, which is probably the most controversial passage in the New Testament, especially about government, and ethicists generally do not like this passage very much, and it has certainly been misused by authoritarians, and I'm very much anti-authoritarian, as you heard yesterday. So therefore, I think we have to go right at this passage and see what it's doing and see what we can make of it. But let's try to follow the logic. Paul is arguing that government authorities have been instituted by God for the good of those that they rule. The way they advance the good of the people that they rule is by deterring or punishing the kind of wrongdoing that threatens the community, especially the peace and order of the community. Now, there's all kinds of difficult interpretive questions from the beginning. For example, I think the text is best read not to say that God has appointed each particular individual to the office that they hold, but instead that the offices themselves are essential to the well-being of the community. So the problem with the first reading is if a person is in power, whoever it might be, name your least favorite leader ever. Just you keep that to yourself, okay? And then it can be said, well, God put them there. I don't read the passage that way. I think that instead it's the offices of authority that are instituted by God for the well-being of the community. Paul is recognizing that every level of human community needs leadership. Human beings are a combination of good yet sinful, high potential yet also the potential for terribly going wrong. I think our theology of the human is really essential to thinking about government. If human beings are just intrinsically good, then maybe we don't even need government. But if human beings are potentially good, made to be good, but also seducible, temptable, corruptible, then every authority structure needs both to try to evoke the good and to encourage the good and to deter the worst in people. So Paul is saying that because government does this, Christians should choose voluntarily to recognize the legitimacy of government authorities and to willingly subject ourselves to them, not just because they can punish us. Like when you go by a police car and you're going too fast and you feel that little tremble of, those lights may be coming my way. The reason we say, yes, officer, politely and the reason we try to go the speed limit more or less, is not only because we're afraid of punishment, says Paul, but because they are there for our good. That's the argument. Now, it is notable that Paul is claiming for God all structures of political authority, even those structures that do not recognize God. So this would mean that the self-understanding of a regime is not at all relevant to Paul's argument. So a government that is atheistic or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or secular or imperial or pagan or Caesarist or democratic or Republican, it doesn't matter what the self-understanding of the government is. Paul is saying there's something happening in government that is a gift from God to us. Now, Paul has been criticized here for what appears to be the authorization of total subjection without resistance to all governments, no matter what they do. Now, it is to be acknowledged that it is easy to read Romans 13 this way, but I don't think it's the best way to read Romans 13. I think that by several times describing what government was instituted by God to do, Paul is also setting up a norm for what government must and must not do. In other words, if Paul is saying government exists to reward the good and punish the bad, then government can be held accountable for rewarding the good and punishing the bad and for not violating that. So the norm is that government is to keep the order and advance the common good of the community. Its agents, whether it's governors or mayors or police officers or DAs or whatever, are to pose no threat to the innocent. This speaks directly to the corruption of state authority or the misuse of power. For example, police misconduct or abuse of prosecutorial authority or something. And the government is to take from people only what is due them. For example, to collect only the taxes that are due and not to extort more. This is already saying within the Roman Empire that there is to be rule of law, that there are boundaries to what the government can do. Now, there is an anarchist strand in Christian tradition which sees government as intrinsically evil, partly because governments have so often been evil, and partly because government carries an authority that is quite intimidating. Governments carry the authority to imprison and often have carried the authority to kill their own people. Government officials have violence that is sanctioned by law. They have that power. It is possible to see government as intrinsically evil because it has that power. Government can take our money, can take our freedom, can take our lives, or demand our lives, for example, drafting our young people to go off to war. Now, the fact that government can do all of these things is one of the reasons why the Anabaptist tradition, with its pacifism, tended to say that no serious Christian could be a participant in government. Its use of violence rules out government service for the followers of the peaceable Christ. Now, but the majority of the Christian tradition did not make that move, rightly or wrongly. I personally think that Paul has some points here that I do believe, that human beings are created good yet fallen, that we need government to prevent chaos and to prevent the rule of the criminal and the bully. Picture the tyrant in a little village seizing the homes and possessions of weaker people in the community. Often happens. Mafia-type figures, criminals of all types, bullies and extortioners and violence wielders. We need government and other structures of authority to prevent that. Government that does that and does not exceed its mandate is indeed a gift from God. But precisely as a gift from God, government and its authorities and its people who serve in it must exist and remember that they exist to serve the people. The people don't exist to serve the government. The principle of submission to government authority does not mean we're not allowed to protest. In fact, I think it means we are obligated to protest if the government violates its mandate. Government can and must be held accountable for its proper functioning. So if Christians read Romans 13 this way, we can have a respectful yet critical lens to engage in public life and to offer oversight of the government that exists to serve us. And even though Paul's thinking about government as top-down, I think this can be made compatible at least with a democratic understanding of government. So that's Romans 13. I would also say that this calls for all Christian citizens a vigilant attention to the actions of government. If the police are overusing or misusing their powers, then that needs to be critiqued. If the schools are not adequately serving the children of certain parts of the community, that needs to be challenged. If the government is not adequately policing in a certain community, they need to be required to do so, and so on. Secondly, the passage in Genesis 1, the lovely passage about the image of God that Andrea so skillfully communicated with the children this morning. By the way, the children's moment is always my favorite moment in all church services. Partly because you never know what's going to happen, right? I love the spontaneity. Genesis 1, 26 and 27 is a central passage in all biblical theology and ethics. As the ultimate act on the sixth day of creation, God makes humans in the divine image. As Andrea was wrestling with the children, what the imago Dei means has been debated. It might refer to unique human capacities like our reason and our creativity and our imagination. It might refer to the responsibilities that God has delegated to us. I think that's definitely here in this passage. The sovereign Lord delegates to human beings sovereignty over the creation and says, be good stewards. It might also refer just simply to God's decision to elevate human status. Treat one another as image bearers of the divine. Definitely that's there, I think. It's interesting that the Jewish tradition, which banned making icons or images of God, here chose to declare human beings to be the icons or images of God. You want to know where to find God's presence or the face of God on the planet? Look around you to your fellow human beings. In relation to government, I think the significance of this passage is the anchor biblical commitment to the God-given worth and dignity of each person without exception. The image of God lays the groundwork for a concept of human rights. Because all are made in the image of God, all human beings can be said to have certain rights. Certain positive and negative rights, that is, negative rights have to do with what should never be done to a human being, like torture or murder or arbitrary arrest. Positive rights have to do with what must be done for human beings just because they're human, like provision of adequate food, education, health care, shelter. Government has unique responsibilities to ensure for its people both that their negative rights are respected and that their positive rights are advanced. Governments can be lobbied and evaluated by Christians based on how well they are doing this. So, by the way, one reason to defend democracy is because it has a proven track record of doing much better in protecting rights than any other form of government does. The image of God must be protected by all, and government, with its vast powers, has a special responsibility here. It's also important to notice that government does not create the worth of persons. God creates the worth of persons. Government simply is to recognize the worth of persons through the policies that it makes and the constitutions that are written. It also means, and I say this with all seriousness, no government and no government official or anybody seeking to enter government should ever attack the worth and dignity of any person or group of people, because all are made in the image of God. For government officials to target populations, even rhetorically, is to threaten not just their dignity, but their lives. When government officials direct negative attention and denigrating commentary on racial, ethnic, religious, gender, sexual, whatever minorities, it is to say, I declare open season on these people. You can do to them what you want. Also, I would say that the image of God applies to everyone. It therefore provides the basis for us to demand of government that all people and groups be treated with a dignity that is commensurate with everybody being made in the image of God. The basis of a politics or a policy of equal rights is right here. Why should everybody have access to decent housing? Why should everybody have access to a decent education? Why should everybody be treated fairly by the police? Because all are made in the image of God. All have rights, worth, and dignity. I would say that the concept of the image of God is one of the most important contributions of the Bible to thinking about government and to concepts like democracy and equality. The Psalm passage, Psalm 72, why in the world did I pick that? There is an entire category of royal psalms. Sometimes they sound a little bit obsequious. Basically, oh, King, you're so wonderful. We love you. God put you in place. May you live forever. May your enemies bow down and lick your feet. We don't really want that kind of thinking about government, but what I think is significant about Psalm 72, and it's one reason it actually appears in lectionary readings often around election season, like in the Catholic tradition, is because Psalm 72 does something unique. It basically says, and here's a psalmist preparing for probably a coronation, saying, packaging it this way: "O God, bless the king with long life and power and dominion as long as the king does justice." As long as the king cares for the poor. As long as the king has a heart for those who are vulnerable. For he delivers the needy when they call. Verse 12. The poor and those who have no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy. He saves the lives of the needy. From oppression and violence he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. Psalm 72 says, "O God, bless this kind of king." I think that's transferable to us. "O God, bless any congressperson, mayor, city councilor, governor, president, Health and Human Services secretary who has a heart for the poor, who cares about doing justice, who loses sleep at night over the threats to the well-being of those who are least able to protect themselves." We need those kinds of leaders. I actually think the psalmist is doing something interesting. God, if you will make this king this kind of king, I know you'll bless him with a very long rule, implicitly. If not, let him go out quickly and let us get a better one. A just government attends to the needs of the poor and all who are deeply vulnerable. It protects them from those people and forces that would crush them into the dust. Because every human being is made in the image of God and every life matters, because the evils that people do are often visited upon the most vulnerable, a key role of government is to array its power on behalf of those who have no protectors. A good government fights for the life of the poor. A good government cares about adequate food for all, adequate housing, health care, social services, old age security, debt, the behavior of the police, and so on. The teaching here is to look for leaders who have a heart for the poor and for those who are most vulnerable. That's not asking too much. Finally, the passage from Matthew, the gospel reading. In this story, a rare combination of Pharisees and Herodians, that is, strict adherents to Jewish law and people who are associated with the corrupt King Herod, combine their forces when Jesus is in the temple in the last week of his earthly life, with the crowd spellbound all around him, while enemies are all around him looking for reasons to arrest him. And so the Pharisees and Herodians try to trap Jesus with a political loyalty question. Is it in accord with Jewish law for Jews to pay taxes to the Roman emperor? That's the question. If Jesus says, sure, go ahead, he could be viewed as a traitor to his people, especially at Passover week with all kinds of Jews from all over the imperial area converging on Jerusalem and on the temple. It was a powder keg politically. If he says, yes, you should pay taxes because God has instituted Caesar or something, he could end up being stoned by his own people. But if he says, no, you don't need to pay taxes, he could be viewed as an insurrectionist and be hauled away by the Roman soldiers that are right there in the temple listening. So his answer is to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's, and we've been arguing about what that means for 2,000 years. The passage has been read dualistically, as if to say, Jesus says that Caesar gets its proper share of our money in taxes and our blood in war and the loyalty of our hearts in patriotism, and God gets our souls. My teacher, Glenn Stassen, said, any dualistic reading of the teaching of Jesus is dangerous. It has been read quite the opposite way. For a radical, prophetic Jewish Messiah like Jesus, surely Caesar deserves nothing, and God deserves everything. So Jesus is not endorsing a tax revolt, but he's not arguing against it. Eventually, there were a variety of tax revolts against the Roman Empire by Jews. Jews were expelled from Rome after this period, partly over a tax revolt. It should also be noted that by asking for a Roman coin and finding it in the hands of his Jewish questioners, Jesus is already exposing their involvement with Roman rule, which includes handling money that contained the image of a human ruler who had idolatrously declared himself to be God. Footnote, watch out for human rulers who have messianic pretensions. Shall I leave it there and just let that hang in the air? Okay. More broadly, never make a human leader, politician of any type into a savior figure. Never. In whatever country that this happens, it's always dangerous. The power of government is sufficient. It doesn't need to be added with messianic pretensions. In a democracy, leaders come and go. They're voted in and out by the people. They're never messiahs. I want to suggest that this teaching of Jesus at least tells us this. The state may well ask us to give it things that go beyond what our loyalty to God will allow us to offer. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's, at least means that sometimes we must say no to the state and its leaders. So there are times in history when Christians have had to draw a line, have had to say no, sometimes at great risk and cost to themselves. No, I will not lie for you. No, I will not go into this war for you. No, I will not implement that unjust policy for you. Fire me, arrest me, or kill me. I will not do that, because God is God and you are not. We must always remember God is God and no earthly authority is God. And sometimes we must say no, even at risk to ourselves. We must sometimes do what government tells us not to do, and we must sometimes not do what government demands of us. This principle is central to the civil disobedience tradition, and it helps to explain, for example, the strategy of the civil rights movement. You tell us we can't sit at the front of the bus, we're going to sit at the front of the bus. You tell us we can't eat in this restaurant, we're going to eat in this restaurant, because the law is unjust and we're trying to get it changed. Perfectly in keeping with the significance of this passage. So, let me conclude with this. Christians have significant guidance in Scripture for thinking about government. That guidance does not depend on living in any particular political system. These 4 passages can still be read in a church in Russia or China or Sweden or Venezuela. The Bible on its own, I would say, does not give us everything we need to develop a case for democracy over monarchy. It does not tell us who to vote for. It does not give us prepackaged answers to policy questions. But it does give us a lot. It gives us a vision as to where a human government comes from, why we need it, what it is supposed to do and not do, how it is to treat human beings made in the image of God, and where its limits are. It gives Christians a charter for caring about what government does. By the way, just simply withdrawing, I don't care about that, I'm just going to watch my Netflix, is too withdrawn. We are not free to disengage in that way. In fact, one might say that disengaging in that way is a privilege that belongs only to those who are not really negatively affected by what government does. Christians have a charter, a sacred charter, for caring about government, for engaging it, obeying it where we should, resisting it where we must. All of this is an aspect of Christian discipleship, and I would say a neglected aspect of Christian teaching and preaching. One reason I think Christians in this country, so many of them, are so confused about what they are looking for in government and its leaders is because their leaders, their preachers and pastors and teachers have not adequately taught this material. So I hope, at least, that these reflections have help you think a little bit about this aspect of discipleship. There are biblical parameters for thinking about government. They are sufficiently concrete as to rule out certain kinds of approaches to government and to give us firm ground to stand on in difficult, divided, and perilous times. May we know where to stand and what it looks like to stand with and for Jesus and for God's rule in this good yet broken world. Amen.